You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 295 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On, kind of the notes here for today's show, China, Syria, and then some information and interesting stories going on in Africa. It looks like the U.S. war in Somalia will be changing. I'm not sure if it's going to be for the better, but I'll give you the details of what we know on that. And this story that's gained some international media headlines, which is that there was a coup d'etat attempt in Gabon just a few hours after U.S. troops arrived in that country. So some interesting stuff, as always, to talk about in today's show, and really appreciate if you could share it, recommend it to anyone. It's really everywhere, iTunes, Stitcher, I post it on Facebook, Twitter, Minds.com. If there's a service out there that's not on, let me know. I'll try to get it up there. But I always suggest people just go to libertarianinstitute.org, where you can find my daily news roundup and this show. I also want to mention to my listeners that the daily news roundup can now be found at the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus website. It's going to be kind of on their news feed there. So, very thankful for them, publishing my work, and go ahead and check out their site. The Mises Caucus guys are always solid on the war issue, and I know, Porter's going to be right in there, so I'm sure there's going to be interesting content on that side as well. If you want to donate to the show, it really does help to support. I just got another donor, and as always, I really appreciate donating to the show, and you'll get AdSense to the bonus content that I do produce. There's not a whole lot of it, but I do a couple episodes a month talking about stuff other than wars, and you can find that there. All right, so gonna start off today's show talking about the acting Secretary of Defense for the United States, and it's this guy, Patrick Shanahan. I've discussed him on the show a couple times in the past, mainly highlighting his track record of being an executive at Boeing. But we have, I guess, his first big meeting at the Pentagon. He's talking and kind of laying out what he's going to do under, kind of his short regime time at the Pentagon. It's likely that, I'm guessing in the coming weeks we'll have Trump nominate someone. And, depending on what's happening with the shutdown and the politics in D.C., I wouldn't expect Patrick Shanahan to be in charge of the Pentagon for more than a couple months here. But in this first meeting, basically the takeaway from it was China, China, China. That's going to be the focus while he's in charge there. Now, this does reflect U.S. policy under things like the National Security Review and Trump's foreign policy strategy papers that have been put out. It's pretty clear that they see that the world issue here not being necessarily terrorism as much anymore, but the great power rivalries with Russia and China. And then they talk about the road states, Iran and North Korea as well. But, here to focus on Russia and China, they say, hey, you now have these kind of rising powers in the world. And, at one time, America controlled most of the world's GDP and only has a small percentage of the world's population. And here we have states like China who are, becoming the largest economies in the world and really competing with the United States on that level. The U.S. is now probably past its unipolar moment, or is really coming to the time where we could do whatever we wanted in the world. Now there's places like we've seen in Syria where the United States just can't bully other states around it, and we really do have to compete with, Russia and China. That being said, looking at that practically, and I think a foreign policy realist like Kevin Drumis, who I had on the show, would explain, is that, this has been brought on by the war on terror. Everything that we've done in the Middle East, all the people we've killed, the atrocities we committed, the American soldiers that, their lives have been lost in the Middle East, and all the money that we've wasted there has really led to the decline in the, U.S. respect and power on the world stage. And so the clear solution then is to bring all the troops home immediately. However, what you have from, the national security strategy and everything is America needs to be bigger, better, tougher, more involved, more interventionist. We need to be doing more, rather than, less, and then gaining back all that wealth and respect that we've lost in these terror wars. I think it is important to note that when you do have these great power rivalries, it pays very well for the military industrial complex, because you build all these weapons like you did in the Cold War that hopefully you'll never have to use, but they're really big and really expensive, and they have to be better than whatever you conceptualize the Russians are doing, because even if they're not actually producing something as great as you think they're producing, what you're producing has to be better than what you think they possibly can produce. So you end up with all these massive, big research and development and all these crazy wartime spending budgets in these kind of Cold War rivalries. And so here you have somebody who has deep ties with the military industrial complex, who's now advocating for a more hawkish rivalry with China. Now, I'm not as in touch on what's going on here as far as economics go, but it is very important to the relationship. And if you have two economies that are tied together, both sides of the Pacific Ocean, just sending massive amount of goods to each other, that would be great and fantastic and very important. And the worst thing that happens is you start to have all these sanctions and then smuggling and all these kinds of issues around that, tariffs and what I don't know if it's a trade war, but certainly tariffs being put on between each other's countries and deteriorating economic relationship is not good in case some accident happens on the seas between your militaries. The more connections you have, I think the less likely you have for war. I think it's the Bastiat quote. I should really know this. Where goods don't cross borders, armies will. And so the more trading you have, the better it is. Scott Horton always uses the example of under the Bush administration, I think it's Bush, you had like the crash of a U.S. spy drone or spy plane in China, and it was really, the Wall Street money that pushed the Bush administration to do a very careful and coordinated negotiations around that. Now, there's a couple of issues here that I just want to highlight that really, I think, from the military side, get in the way of talks. And maybe it's because, at least the way it's reported in the U.S. media, they really report a dichotomy between the trade wars and, these freedom of navigation is what they call missions by the U.S. government, but they're really shows of force, where we fly our planes or our ships around islands and territories claimed by China. So China claims Taiwan, so we sail our ships to the Taiwan Strait to show, well, China, you really don't control Taiwan, see it's an independent state. And then, of course, you have the islands claimed in the territorial waters of the South China Sea. China says they control the territorial waters of the South China Sea. If you look at how other agreements work around the world, that it seems like quite a stretch that China should have control of all those territorial waters. But it's really none of the U.S.'s business, and I'm not well read enough on the issue to be able to issue a very good, detailed briefing of this is who should control what waters and why, and this should be international. But, the U.S. continues to carry out these military exercises while the talks are ongoing. And so I think they do get in the way of the talks, but the way that, as I was saying, they're always presented to the Americans, it's like Trump is really wrong on the talks, and that's why, there's all this criticism and tension paid towards the trade war and kind of how that's America's fault. But yet when you have these freedom of navigation stuff, well, first of all, this is an Obama policy, the pivot to Asia, the start under the Obama administration. But I think because, even the liberal media is so pro-military, they kind of present this as a different thing where it's not America being obnoxious and hawkish. It's really the Chinese that aren't letting and overreaching and overstepping. And so I'm sure, that hawkishness either on trade or on military has effects on the others, and much more so than Americans realize. Now, from China, I think one of the ways that as, the U.S. loses their unipolar moment and as the United States continues to look to put pressure on China, one of the ways that they could kind of reclaim from the United States or take back would be to put additional pressure on Taiwan. And I don't know if they would ever be able or would go, with a military campaign and occupy Taiwan. But they could certainly do different things, maybe like blockade the Taiwan Strait or have some kind of activity like that where they really harass Taiwanese ships in the surrounding waters. And Taiwan, in response, has, kind of put out a call for people to, protect the democracy of Taiwan. I will say I've seen a lot of reporting over the past 2 years about China looking to gain more support from, different nations around the world and push them to do small things and make small changes in their country regarding Taiwan. Like at their airports, they have to put that Taiwan, is a part of China, like on their airport signs and on their tickets and everything. And, they've really pushed African states to adopt the one China policy. For further reading on this, there's an article in, I believe, UN's review by Eric Margolis, who explains, the rising tensions between the United States and China and all the different factors in a little bit more detail than I got into. So if you want more detailed reading, check that out. It's in the show notes page. I want to mention Iran briefly here. We have Mike Pompeo issuing a statement saying that if Iran continues to launch rockets into space, that this would be a violation of a UN Security Council resolution saying that Iran should not produce, I think, missiles, kind of capable of nuclear capabilities. Now, I've talked in the past on the show about how a space program and a nuclear missile program are not the same things, and there's really not a whole lot of overlapping information there. It's kind of, but it falls in the same category of like the Iran civilian nuclear program. Well, if you have a civilian energy nuclear program, then yeah, you're going to produce some things and have some of the same material needed to make a nuclear weapons program, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be allowed to have your civilian program. And so even if there is some overlap here between, a space rocket and a nuclear rocket, it doesn't mean that the Iranians should be prevented from making this. Now, I think in a fair reading of the UN Security Council resolution, the Iranians really aren't in violation of it, but the United States has continued since the thing was passed to claim Iran's in violation of it. Iran, says the opposite, that we're not in violation, and they have a sensible reading where it says that, yeah, they could launch these space rockets. I also want to note that Richard Goldberg, who was at FDD before it's, kind of establishment blob think tank kind of thing, and this guy's a huge Iran hawk. He was hired to the National Security Council, and so in the Trump administration, it's been so hard to tell, and increasingly with this Syria thing, who actually holds influence over the president and how important the role of John Bolton is. I was just reading in Haaretz today that John Bolton is kind of, cast off to the side and is in the president's inner circle and is jokingly referred to as some staffers as Mike Bolton, and that Donald Trump doesn't really know who the guy is. And so maybe this hiring is completely unimportant and isn't a bad side at all, but it doesn't seem like a good thing anytime you hire an Iran hawk. And if John Bolton one day does gain favor with the president, or this, Richard Goldberg guy ends up in a meeting with him and really impressing Donald Trump, it could be a very bad thing. I read a very important story, and I'm going to link to this in the show notes page, and it's something that I'm guessing that in the future I'm going to be referring to on the show again and again. But it talks about the proliferation of anti-tank guided missiles in the Middle East, specifically ones that are American, Russian, and Iranian made. I think the most common American one in the Middle East would probably be the TOW anti-tank missile, and then the Russian, I think, is called the Kornet. But these are rockets that could be fired over a mile away at armored vehicles or armored targets, and even I think at times they shot down a Russian helicopter with one, some Syrian rebel groups, and they could be kind of remotely controlled. So, you fire from a mile away, and then you kind of have some wiggle room as far as, getting it to line up exactly with your target. They could blow through like 3 feet of, kind of steel and armor. So they're very dangerous and effective weapons. And so what this article kind of points out is that there's more and more of these in the Middle East. And we know what's going to happen is that, they're going to filter down to groups and different kinds of people. And, they're going to fall into, there's certainly, the Houthis have a lot of them in Yemen. Of course, I'm not trying to say that the Iranians or the Russians or the Americans gave the Houthis a bunch of anti-tank guided missiles. But, my point is that as we've added so many of these to the Middle East, and not just America, other countries, there's now a proliferation of them. And so my guess is that this is going to make troop movement in the Middle East, not only by the U.S., but by other governments, increasingly difficult. If you can't even carry your troops from one section to the other country in armored vehicles because some jihadists a mile away on a mountaintop shoot a guided missile at you, well, that's a real problem and something that's probably real difficult to deal with. Syria stuff. So on the last show, I mentioned that Syrian rebels are fighting against the Turkish-backed rebels, the jihadist guys versus the Turkish-backed guys there in northern Syria, and that the Syrian jihadist rebels were having some success. According to Jason Ditz at antiwar.com, 20 towns and villages have been taken. So this is a pretty significant thing, and it's really causing cracks in the foundation of the ceasefire agreement in Idlib, as you now have an expanded control of groups who don't consider themselves parties to the ceasefire agreement, now not only attacking the Turkish-backed militants, but also the Assad and Russian forces and who are responding by bombing. So the very interesting news out of Turkey today regarding Syria is that John Bolton traveled to Turkey. He's been touring around the Middle East to meet with Turkish President Recep Erdogan, and then was snubbed by Erdogan, and apparently just met with John Bolton's own counterpart. John Bolton had recently made some statements, I believe in Israel, saying that the U.S. withdrawal from Syria is conditioned on a protected Kurdish region. So basically we wouldn't leave in a way that would allow a slaughter against the Kurds. And primarily this would, the biggest concern is that this happens, I believe, from Turkey, not from the Iran, Russia, Syria, Assad axis in these battles. And that, this doesn't help the rise of ISIS. And so Erdogan, came out today and he said, nope, I don't agree to this. I have a problem with this. What America agreed to was a withdrawal of Syria. And so this, I guess it came as a little bit of a surprise to me at the start, because on my initial reading of it, I would think it would be a good thing for Turkey to have Syria basically kind of, take over the Kurdish territory and, made some kind of deal with Turkey, where in exchange for Turkey not invading, the Syrian government does a relatively good job preventing Syrian Kurds from taking any weapons over the border between Syria and Turkey. But, the more I read about it, the more maybe Erdogan is really counting this thing wrong and sees Syrian Kurdistan as a region that he must conquer to kind of suppress the Kurds, or else they're just going to continue to attack the Turkish state. So we could get into a lot of debate here about, how much the Syrian Kurds are tied to the Turkish Kurds and how much of a threat the Syrian Kurds potentially pose to Turkey or the Turkish government from suicide attacks or using the weapons they have to cross over the border and attack Turkey. I do think the Syrian YPG is very close to the Turkish PKK, these being the two Syrian militant groups in both countries. But I don't know if the Syrian Kurds really present any kind of threat to Turkey, especially if Turkey isn't picking a fight with them first, like we have already seen in Afrin. And so while it seems to me that if Erdogan were to take Syrian Kurdish territory, that would just leave him in worse position, because he's going to be fighting insurgencies there and really upsetting all of Syrian Kurdistan and causing them to throw more and more fighters at his Turkish invaders. But I don't think that's the calculation that Erdogan makes now, and really believes that he needs to control Syrian Kurdistan to keep Turkey safe. What I'm hoping happens here is that, Turkey has a pretty decent relationship with Russia at this point. Russia, of course, is allies with Assad, and that Russia is able to negotiate kind of the withdrawal of the United States with the United States in a coordinated way where Turkey doesn't cross into Syria, and Assad is able to retake all of Syrian Kurdistan, and then south of that in the Syrian, eastern Syria Arab areas. All right, Africa stuff here. Somalia first. So we have a Pentagon plan that basically says that they no longer see Somalia's Al-Shabaab. It's the terrorist group in Al-Shabaab has pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden. However, I on the show in the past, I've argued that they're really not an international terrorist group and more of a Somalia-located insurgency, fighting against the government there. At one point in time, they had controlled even the capital of that country and now control a large area of southern Somalia. But the Pentagon assesses that they're no threat to the U.S. They said that the airstrikes over the past couple of years in the Trump administration, I think plus 20 in 2017, and we're getting the number now 46 or 47 in 2018. Now, who knows how accurate these numbers are? It could be several times more than that, the actual number of U.S. airstrikes in these countries. 500 plus people killed in those airstrikes. Every single time a U.S. bomb hits Somalia, the U.S. claims that only militants were killed. It's so hard to discern the truth there that I have really a hard time letting any of you guys know if the people killed are actually militants and if they would ever be a threat to the United States. I mean, if it's just the local insurgency fighting against the government there, who says that we need to bomb them? I mean, the Somali government and their forces certainly carry out brutal attacks against the people. I've talked about a 2016 massacre a few times on the show where Somali forces were involved and likely American forces too. Killed about 10 civilians, execution style. And so the Pentagon plan looks like they say they're going to reduce the number of U.S. forces in Somalia. Not sure by how many. I know the Pentagon has said that they're keeping forces in Somalia, but withdrawing a few, that seems to be a plus. But it seems they're transferring the airstrike calling into the CIA. And so maybe this just means more CIA boots on the ground in Syria. I don't know if this necessarily means less airstrikes. Who calls in less? The CIA or the Army. Good comparison maybe we'll see here. There's been a lot of attacks on Al-Shabaab in the past year. And I do want to just say here, it does look like things are heating up on the ground in Somalia. I talked back on a couple weeks past. You had the arrest of a former Al-Shabaab member who was running for a regional president after going through, they set up these things. We saw this in Colombia with the FARC. We see it in different groups around the world where you have a terrorist-like insurgency, and eventually you realize you gotta start bringing some of these guys in from the cold. They're regional leaders. They're the people that, the people in their areas look up to. You can't kill them all off, or else, you're not gonna have anybody that you could deal with. And so they set up these processes where you're able to take certain steps to show that you're no longer a member of that group and allow you to recognize and run for office. And so the guy who was arrested says, he went through all those steps and is now fair to run for office. The Somali government said no and arrested him. This led to the UN envoy condemning the Somali government, and then the Somali government saying that the UN envoy is a persona non grata, meaning get the hell out of our country. I guess the UN is sending a different envoy to Somalia, and they're saying they're, not going to be as vocal this time around. The arrest of that presidential candidate did cause some protests where the Somali government cracked down on the protesters and killed a few innocent people there. And we seem to have more fighting between the Somali government and the kind of Al-Shabaab group, with a recent killing of a police chief, I believe in Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia. So a pretty high-ranking member of the Somali police, and just more and more attacks on Al-Shabaab forces in southern Somalia. And like I said, we get the reports from the Somali government and from the U.S. government that militants were killed, but as far as I'm aware, there's no aid groups on the ground that are able to confirm this. All right, I'm Duke Gabon here. I'm not going to take too long, but it's not all that long of a story, really. So you have one of the most interesting coup d'etat attempts I've ever seen. Apparently, there's not a lot of co-conspirators here. So 5 guys, I believe, go to a radio station, I guess a prominent one in Gabon, and take it over. And then you have a guy sitting there, and he starts, reading off a thing. And I guess what he calls for, because I don't speak whatever the language he's speaking there is for people to come out and kind of defend the radio station, and that, they've taken over the country now. The coup attempt was defeated relatively quickly. Police forces came in and dismissed the protesters that did show up, and shooed them away, went in and took those guys. Two coup plotters were killed, 7 were captured. And, that was the end of the deal there. Now, the reason I think this gained a little bit more international media attention is just before this, we had the stories released saying that Donald Trump had positioned about 80 U.S. military personnel in Gabon in order to possibly evacuate Americans if things go south next door in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I've talked about the ongoing Ebola outbreak there. We have a presidential election now about a week and a half ago results for that election were supposed to be released Sunday, but the government delayed that. So there's a whole bunch of protesting going on in the Congo. It looks like, that's a powder keg right now in a very dangerous and potentially explosive region. I'm not sure if I agree with the president's decision to send troops to Gabon, but I do want to just point out that, the situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is pretty crazy right now. So, yeah, those 80 U.S. troops arrived. As far as I can tell, they didn't play a role in the coup d'etat. There is, I guess, an interesting piece here, too, with that the leader of Gabon was recently hospitalized, I believe, from a stroke, and it doesn't look like he is in great health anymore. I'm not sure what, his mental capacities are or how severe the stroke was or anything like that. I think he was and possibly still getting treatment in Morocco, so may even be out of the country. But who knows what the U.S. forces are doing there, and if there's a fear that the government there could be overthrown, and the fact that U.S. troops go and that there's a question because the U.S. has been involved in so many coup d'etats over the year, certainly I think is just part of the U.S. foreign policy being what it is and has been. All right, that's where I wrap up the show for today. Hope everybody enjoyed it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, Twitter at KYAAALE, my news website, immersionnews.com. Really check that thing out. It's really cool. I think you'll enjoy it. And then minds.com, the crypto social network. There I'm at Immersion News.